Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It is really exciting to be with you, and we at the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities are thrilled to be able to partner with the Valentine Richmond History Center, TMI, and others for this Future Richmond's Past for this community conversation series. Tonight is a beginning of a conversation that we look forward to having over the next 5 months as we explore 5 decades in Richmond's history. The Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities was known at its founding in 1935 in Virginia as the NCCJ, the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And the organization in 1963 started an event called the Brotherhood Citation Dinner, which has evolved over the years to now be known as the Humanitarian Awards Dinner. And so as we were thinking about this year being the 50th anniversary of the Humanitarian Awards Dinner, we wanted to look back and learn about Richmond's history from the perspective of humanitarians. And we're thrilled tonight to have one of our past award winners here with us. I'll tell you as an aside, and it's a sad statement about our region losing some of its history. We had a challenging time connecting with honorees from the 1960s. Because if you think about someone who was getting an award in the 1960s, that person was likely in his or her 40s or 50s at the time. And so we were reaching out to several of the children, and in some cases grandchildren, of those award winners. One of whom is in Florida right now, and said he wasn't able to come. One said he doesn't like driving at night, and so he didn't want to be here. One said he didn't really remember much about the 60s, and so he didn't want to be here. But we're thrilled that Dr. Allix B. James said yes to us. Dr. James lived in several places before coming to Richmond. The last place before Richmond was Marshall, Texas, and he arrived in 1942. He was greeted by a pretty stark contrast of segregation and racism throughout the region, but also a welcoming environment at Virginia Union University. And while his plan was to be at Virginia Union and to be in Richmond for 2 years, from 1942 to 1944, it is now 2012, and he is still in Richmond, and we are all the beneficiaries of that history. Dr. James, after graduating from Virginia Union University with his undergraduate degree, stayed and received a Master of Divinity degree. He then served in many faculty and administrative roles, serving as an instructor of biblical studies, as Dean of Students, as Dean of the School of Theology, as Vice President, President, Professor of Pastoral Theology, Chancellor and Dean, and President Emeritus. In addition to his work on campus, Dr. James was a significant icon in the broader Richmond region. He was the first African American to be elected as president of the Virginia State Board of Education. He was the first African American to be elected president of the Association of Theological Schools in the United States and Canada. He was the first African American person to be named to a major corporate board in Virginia. He was the first to serve as president of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Among his many awards, in 1975, Dr. James received the Humanitarian Award from what was then the National Conference of Christians and Jews, and he's also the only person to have received a second award from our organization in 2009, the Jeffrey B. Spence Award for Interfaith Understanding. He has written a book and a supplement to the book, 70+, The Pilgrimage of an African American Educator, which explores his life from 1922 to 1997. And then a supplement, A Legacy of Leadership That Continues Today, which was published in the last year by Dr. James. And the last thing I'll say before we get to hear from him is that on December 17th, Dr. James celebrated his 90th birthday. He had over 100 people on the campus of Virginia Union for a wonderful birthday celebration. Family members, friends, elected officials, all to celebrate the legacy and the life of Dr. Allix Bledsoe James. So we are indeed able to sit at the feet of a giant in Richmond's history and learn tonight. And I'll ask you, Dr. James, to talk first about your initial impressions of Richmond. You arrived in 1942. What do you remember from that time period?
In 1942, I came from San Antonio, Texas, to continue my education at Virginia Union University. I came as a junior student because I finished a junior college in San Antonio. So I plan to do my junior and senior year here and then move on to graduate school elsewhere. But those 2 years turned into 70 years. And I've been here ever since. But in order that you might understand how Richmond greeted a stranger from San Antonio, Texas, at that time, airline travel wasn't popular. See, every day, y'all talk about traveling plane, but back then it was either bus, train, or car. That's a long time ago, wasn't it? Well, when I got to Washington, D.C., the conductor tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Follow me." I know what he meant. He's in charge of transportation. So I followed him. He took me to a segregated car right behind the coal-fired engine. But the soot and the coal dust and everything else turned my white shirt into a gray shirt. When I got to Broad Street Station, there was a dispatcher in the middle of the station giving directions. This way, that way. Whites, you got this door. Blacks, you got the side door. Or I want the side door. I got in the line to get a cab to get to Virginia Union. I noticed that people who got in line after me received attention more than I was receiving it. So I asked the dispatcher, I said, "Well, what about me? The people came after me." He said, "Be patient. Your cab is coming." And that cab was Manhattan Cab, a cab company owned by blacks. At that time, whites and blacks didn't necessarily ride the same cabs in Richmond. I got in the Manhattan Cab, and because it was late in the afternoon, it was really evening, then by 10 o'clock at night, really, asked the cab driver, say, "Is there any place I can get anything to eat before I hit the campus?" He said, "Well, sure, there's a white tower on the corner of Broad and Lombardi, just a few blocks from the campus. So that's en route. Let's stop there." He said, "It's just a hamburger place." I said, "Well, if you're hungry, even a hamburger is good 10 o'clock at night." So I went in the front door of the hamburger joint, white tower, at Lombardi and Broad, and the cashier told me, "Take out to the side window." I said, "Thank you, no thank you." I got back in the cab, went to the camp, hungry that night. The next morning I got up with a group of new students at the university. We wanted to explore downtown Richmond. So we walked from the campus up to Broad Street. At that time, you didn't have bus, you had streetcars. Any of you remember streetcars?
Yeah.
Well, that was the system, streetcars. So we got on the streetcar, took our seats. And we noticed that the streetcar didn't move. And so we asked the conductor, say, when are we going to, on our way downtown? He said, "When you fill it from the back, we'll move." Well, here we were. Strangers, youngsters from different parts of the country, not even registered. as a student of Virginia Union, knowing no one in Richmond. Now, the decision was to be a troublemaker that morning, or to get off and walk. Wisdom told us to get off and walk, because if they put us in jail, the Time-Dispatch headline the next morning would be, "Troublemakers come to Richmond to start trouble." So we walked down Broad Street, and we noticed, we passed 2 or 3 little restaurants with little signs in the window, small signs, white only. So we, a fellow from New York was in that group. He said, "Well, there's a Woolworth downtown. I know that we can get something to eat there because I'm from New York and Woolworth's open in New York." We went to Woolworth and stood at the counter. The cashier said, "Takeout service to the end." So, those are my first 24 hours in Richmond. What an experience for a stranger. 2,000 miles from home, being treated almost like an outcast. We saw a young man who was well groomed. We asked him about an eating place where we could get lunch. He recommended Slaughter's Hotel and Cora's Waffle Shop on Leach Street. So we had lunch there. So those were the first hours in Richmond. But those first hours in Richmond put a determination in me. If ever I could do anything to bring about changes in the capital city of the Confederacy, I was going to do it. So every opportunity came around for me to work in organizations, I began working in those organizations.
So let's talk, Dr. James, a little bit about that work. So 1942, you arrived. After those 24 hours, you stayed in Richmond, much to our benefit all these years later. And 18 years later, you were a dean at Virginia Union University and about to become vice president. And in 1960, we heard about, in the CERT quiz, one of the significant events was Virginia Union students marching to downtown Richmond, lunch counters, and then holding a sit-in at Tallheimer's. What do you remember from that, and particularly what was your role as an administrator of Virginia Union?
Well, as Dean of Students, naturally I was in charge of all student affairs. And so the Dean of the college and I got together and said, we're going to support our students in this movement. And as long as they're peaceful and nonviolent, we're with them 100%. And we supported them all the way during that sit-in movement. My wife and I put up our home as collateral, just in case a union student would be arrested, so wouldn't have to stay in jail. And Billy Tallheimer, he was head of the Tallheimer department store. He was a moving factor in bringing that program to a conclusion. He wasn't for it, but he had to join the other companies or else he would be ostracized. There were a committee of 4. He would have us each day to break the picket line, to come up to his office and say we could strategize to bring this terrible movement to a conclusion. And through Billy Tallheimer's efforts and the effort of the committee, and some other things that happened, even on the national front, the whole thing broke. There was a time when blacks couldn't try on clothes in Millen Roads. If you want to buy a hat, they would put a stocking cap on your head to make sure that no grease or anything else would get on the hat. Those were some days, my friend. But those are the days that we endured, and thank God Almighty, they're changed. Now you tell some of you youngsters, and probably some of you youngsters here tonight, just can't envision dear old Richmond acting in such a terrible manner. But I'm here the living witness. It was Richmond, and thank God we now have a new Richmond. Now when that conductor tapped me on the shoulder on that plane, he never envisioned that one day that same man on whose shoulder you tapped would be head of the State Board of Education. He didn't know that that man would become president of all the theological schools in the United States and Canada. He didn't know that man would be chairman of the Richmond Planning Commission. Friends, it's not the color of one's skin. It's the contents of one's mind and character. And that's what we have to emphasize forever and forever and forever. For all of us are made in the image of Almighty God, and we're God's children living together in a peaceful society.
So,
When Richmond Memorial Hospital was built, that's fantastic. Community is getting together. They had one floor for blacks in Richmond Memorial Hospital. I'll never forget, there was one man on the board, and he protested the idea of one floor designated for blacks. And this man told this deep-seated Southerner there's going to come a time when the black and the white would be sharing the same room. Several years later, that happened, and that black called that Southern white man and said, "Mister, I told you it's going to happen. It has happened. I'm now visiting a friend in Richmond Hospital, and his roommate is a white person." Times have changed. We have learned lessons from the past. And when we think about it, how ridiculous was all that foolish happening. But it happened, and we live by it. And even today, some people still have not lived some of those crazy notions, but hopefully, before I get to be 100, all of it might be erased. It's on the way, but not there yet.
So let's
We've
talk
come
about
a long way, but a long ways to go.
So in the 1960s, there were significant events that helped to move civil rights forward. Here in Richmond and certainly around the country, we can think about the I Have a Dream speech, we can think about assassinations of key political and social leaders. What do you remember being the reaction to those? Were there, in Richmond, were there reactions the way we saw in some other communities where there were riots and other things? What was happening?
Well, Richmond wasn't as bad as some other towns, thank goodness. We didn't have the same riots in Richmond that we had in other cities. and I have to contribute that to the leadership that we had. We had some very dynamic leaders in Richmond, and those leaders had followers who would at least listen to them. I remember Dr. Henderson, who was president of the university at the time, and I was vice president. We organized an $18 million campaign. And we're out to get a leadership gift from someone in Richmond to head the campaign. And this man said, if you will promise us that your students will never demonstrate, will never march, will never participate in any civil rights movement, I'll give you $1 million to head your campaign. Dr. Henderson looked at me, I looked at him, and as bad as we needed that $1 million, would have said, thank you, no thank you. And it was enough. It was the next day with Emmett Till. You remember Emmett Till? You heard of him? He was murdered in Mississippi. There was the president of the student body at the University of Richmond called the president of our student body and said, this is awful. Let us have a protest from your campus to the state capitol to protest Emmett Till's murder. Now Dr. Henderson looked like fools. Stand in the middle of the campus, y'all go back. Don't y'all protest? We got $1 million coming.
Next day.
But we did it, and we never regretted that movement. There's another strange that happened. Dr. A.J. Richardson, who was an official with the State Board of Education during the 60s. In fact, at that time, I think he was the only executive who had an earned terminal degree. But they wouldn't give him an office down in the State Board of Education building. They rented an office for him in a black business building in Jackson Ward, the Southern A building on Clay Street. Those are the kind of things we had to endure. Time to change, thank God.
We heard also a little bit earlier that Richmond in the 1960s had its first female mayor. Do you remember how that came about and what the reaction was to that? Eleanor P. Shepard in 1962?
Well, Eleanor Shepard was a delightful lady, and she really had the support of the black community. And we were very pleased that Richmond had matured enough to have a female mayor. And of course, we got the first black mayor, you know, that was real victorious. And then, Virginia Union takes pride in the fact that not only gave Richmond first black mayor, but gave Virginia the first black governor in the United States. Virginia Union graduate. Those are the kind of students we have produced in the years, and we're proud of the fact that Union has made that kind of contribution, and we never would take a back seat and lower our standards, our thinking, to buy other people's ideas.
So we're talking a little bit about some of the social movements, civil rights, those things. I wonder also if we can talk just about life in Richmond. So in the late 1950s, 1956, Willow Lawn Shopping Center was built. In 1958, the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike opened. We saw a little bit later on, between 1963 and 1965, a huge downtown boom with the construction of more than 700 buildings in the city. What was life like before that downtown boom? What was life like in Richmond afterward?
Well, Richmond was kind of departmentalized for a while. People in South Richmond traded on Hall Street. People in South Side would trade around little stores that were more or less community oriented. But they got to the place where they started shopping downtown like everybody else. But the strange thing about that, there was a right side of Broad Street and a wrong side of Broad Street. Have you heard of that?
No, tell us.
Some folks have,
No, tell
some
us.
folks have not, so.
Anytime a store would operate on the side of the street opposite Middle Roads and Tall Island, that was the wrong side. The right side is where the big department stores were. Therefore, the smaller stores had to do the best they could. And they really figured that at the wrong side of Broad Street.
What was the impact, if you remember, on the building of Interstate 64 and Interstate 95? We know that there were neighborhoods that were displaced, homes that were demolished. Do you remember how those decisions were made about where those roads were placed and what the impact was on particular communities?
Well, it broke up a lot of communities. In fact, I ran through some areas in West End. Some lovely homes were destroyed. And you take downtown, some historic places were destroyed because of interstate. But they thought it was for the good of the community, so it went through. And city council had the power to make those kind of decisions, and they were made. And but now we found out that the shopping malls have just taken over from downtown. In fact, there's hardly any downtown now for shopping, for business, for financial district, yes. But you find very little shopping downtown now because people go to the shopping mall with plenty of parking and other advantages that will serve their needs. So times have just changed.
What do you remember in the 1960s, Dr. James, about regional relations? I've read a little bit about consideration of consolidation in the early 1960s, and then their annexation. What were the relations between the city of Richmond and Rico, Chesterfield, Hanover? Have you seen any movement from the 1960s?
Not very little, and I think after the annexation of Chesterfield, moving into part of Richmond, I think that was the last big annexation. And I think everything since that time has been annexation against it, because they want to be separate.
Do you remember some of those decisions as being controversial? Were people upset about them? Was it?
But upset, but didn't have the power to do anything about it because the people in power made the decision. And as long as you have the power structure making the decision, you're helpless. Not what you can do. That's why it's good to get into the power-based organizations where your vote will count and your voice will be heard and people will listen to you.
I want to think a little bit, we've talked about some Richmond events. I want to think about what was happening nationally in the 1960s. So we had Kennedy beating Nixon in the presidential election in 1960, taking over in 61. And then he was assassinated in 1963. Lyndon Johnson defeating Barry Goldwater in 1964 in the election. and then civil rights legislation coming out of that, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What was that time period like politically? We hear a lot, especially this week, about politics in the U.S. And dysfunction. What do you remember from that time period nationally and the residue in Richmond?
Well, I think that period opened the eyes of a lot of people that it's time to change. And because there was time for change, you had people running for office nationally that they wouldn't run before. You take, you had very few black people in Congress. In fact, I remember a time we only had 1 or 2 black congressmen. But now we have more than that. And I think that period brought about those changes. Lyndon Johnson did a whole lot to create a good spirit in America. Did a whole lot.
Do you remember 1964 and 65 Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act as being definitive moments? Was life different before them for you than after them? Or as you saw education in Richmond, as you saw voting in Richmond, as you saw where people lived in Richmond, did things change as a result of those laws from your perspective?
Well, there are some people who felt that blacks and white can't study together and get a good education. Well, that's the most ridiculous thing you ever heard. Nobody had any monopoly on brain power. And a lot of the people in the city started sending their students to county school because they thought to get a better education in a county school rather than a predominantly black school system. That's not necessarily true. If the child has the ability, that child can learn. But it's just a hangover from the days when segregation was the order of the day. It comes out in subtle ways now. Before, it was blatant, but today it's subtle, but it's still there in a lot of places.
What do you remember about key social movements, protests at the time? Vietnam War was taking place, we had the Cold War, feminism, significant, gay rights movement. What do you remember in Richmond? We saw an image of Monroe Park, folks gathering there. Were those social movements common? How was the Vietnam War in particular responded to in Richmond from your memory?
I don't remember in detail about it. Some people felt it should be supported and felt it was a mistake. But I never got into the intricacies of the significance of all of that. And therefore I really can't speak authoritatively on that subject.
I want to ask you a little bit about what you remember about NCCJ at the time, the predecessor to the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, and particularly the significance of the Humanitarian Awards dinner at the time, the Brotherhood Citation Dinner. So I'll ask you a little bit about that, and then we'll invite some questions from folks here, so be thinking about those as we hear a little bit. 1963, the Brotherhood Citation Awards dinner was started. That was the first one, December 11th of that year. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and what was involved? What made that significant? I think there were maybe close to 800 people there.
Yeah. Well, at that time, there was the biggest dinner of that nature in the whole state. And it was a big deal. But I hate to admit this, but it's the truth. Even NCCJ had problems. I remember a committee of 4 of us going to the administration of NCCJ and say, it's about time now that you can find at least one black qualified to get an award. The answer was, it may hurt our receipts. Are you more interested in what the organization stands for? Are you more interested in the dollar? See, you know, sometimes we have to put the dollar behind us. Just like Dr. Henson, I put that $1 million behind us. Sometimes we have to stand on principle. And it took us several years to get NCCJ. And I'm an opponent of it. I've been working with them all these years to be convinced that you don't honor people just because of what they bring in financially, but because what they have meant to the community. So now NCCJ has come alive. We honor people who are worthy to be honored, and the dollar is not a significant factor.
So let's hear some questions from you.